Very helpful, isn't it? Hey, everybody. Thanks for being here and joining thoughtbot's Open Summit and me in particular. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever one applies to you. Thanks for joining us. Cool. All right. So, I think that one's going to be the best for you to be able to see the slides. So here, this is one of my favorite XQCD comics about commit messages, and that's actually what we're here to talk about. Commit messages to the rescue. So my name is Aji, my pronouns are they, them, and I've worked at thoughtbot since about 2022. I gave a lightning talk version of this before, and I wanted to set up some of the situations in which commit messages could save your bacon. So I came up with a story about a workplace that could have been helped by good commit message practice. When looking for what pictures to put on my slides during the story, I reached for Dr. Seuss imagery. I especially liked it because the fish from Cat in the Hat could be the project manager, and that felt right to me. So I present to you get add, get RM, get commit minus M. Definitely not by Dr. Seuss. An e-commerce site on AWS is a good enough scene for our story, I guess. A dev team made up of front, full stack, and back, thing one and thing two, employed there to hack on tickets, on post-its from colorful charts, building the flow of the site's shopping carts. With a click and a clack, a feature enhancing, new user experience, code editors dancing. But oh, the commit messages were as sparse as the air, no explanation of changes, no context to spare. Months later, when users cried out in despair, Thing 2 found a bug and quite tangled software. Even through all the planning down deep in Rails magic, requests had timeout, causing dips in their traffic. Strange behavior caused quite a fright, no documentation, no end in sight. With furrowed brow and frustrated mind, Thing 2 searched for answers, hoping to find the bug so elusive, a mystery unsolved. The team's consternation grew and evolved. Thing 2 scratched her head, rubbing their eyes. The lack of context made the fix a disguise. Call Aaron Patterson, call the bike shed. The server log's lines are nothing but red. If only Thing 1 had penned words with care, the bug would have been caught, patched, quickly repaired. So remember this lesson, programmers take heart. Document your changes before troubles start. In our jobby jobs, missing clarity fails. Just think, with no context, apps run off the rails. I'm just gonna have to imagine your wild cheering and applause. So fun's over, down to business. Get happens. We all do it, and we agree commit messages are important, but we probably cut some corners here and there. I don't want to stand up here and tell you you're all doing something wrong because you're not, but you might not be getting the most out of your commit messages. In general, version control is something that's taught fairly early on in learning to code. It was for me. So the concepts need to be imparted in uncomplicated ways. It's a save point, like in a video game. It's a moment captured in time. It's like saving your work as you go along. If you like those or not, I'm fairly confident there wasn't much time spent on it, and we were told to just use -M. At the time, either when you're first learning coding or first learning Git, there's a lot to take in because Git is a little inaccessible at best. So simplifying the steps is important to help learn. So we're shown -M and told to write a brief description and move on. Especially because if we type git commit without the -M, we were going to get stuck in a twilight zone from which there is no escape. Git commit would land us in Vim. But I use Vim as my daily driver now, and so too I've circled back around to Git and commit messages. Because when they aren't thought about as a tool, but a hindrance to work, or as a chore that we have to do, we end up with messages that are unhelpful, incredulous, maybe a bit on the nose, even desperate, dishonest, depressing, downright belligerent. Yeah, I don't know about this one, but I'd come around on Vim. Could I decipher the intricacies and arcane knowledge required to make full use of Git? I started to look into commit messages. I read some blogs, a forum post or two, Stack Overflow questions, and a few pieces of advice rose to the top time and time again. Have you seen rules like these? Use imperative tense, start with a capital letter, don't end with a period. Do you use them? Are you seeing these ideas for the first time? Some of these have reasons behind them. You keep the subject line short because Git will truncate it at about 50 characters. Capital letter, period, the tense you use, that's all just tabs or spaces. There's a convention we gravitate to, those conventions, but if your team or your project prefers something else, has a different style guide, go for it. But dash M, that just isn't going to get the job done. Let's take a moment and look at some commit messages I pulled from GitHub. How many of you have written a commit message like this? How about this? What about this? Yeah, me too. What do these examples have in common? They all follow those canonical rules just fine. Stylistic consistency is enforced, but they're addressing the wrong things. These examples all had something else in common. They did not include a body to the commit message. The habit of not using message bodies is so prevalent that I bet there are some great developers out there who are capable, smart, wonderful developers that have never written a commit message body. There might be some listening to me right now. And to you, if you're out there, I can't wait to share the new perspective on this boring, common tool because it absolutely can be a game changer. We've seen some examples, and it seems pretty easy to agree on what makes a commit message unhelpful, but what goes into a good commit message. This is from a thoughtbot open source project called Clearance, with the subject line, use route independent password, reset, redirect. And the body, using edit user password URL requires that particular path helper to exist, and that's not necessarily the case. Since all we want to do is redirect to the same action, we can use URL for instead. It's concise but descriptive subject. In 2 sentences, the message conveys the problem that required a change to be made, the intention of the code originally, and therefore what the change is aiming for, and it references the main point of the solution. This is the little commit message that could. So much conveyed with only as much text as it needs. This is more to type than a 50-character -M message, but wouldn't you already have this kind of information in your head if you had just made this change? There's not a lot of extra work to make this kind of thing happen. Let's take a look at an example from the Rails repo. Fix secret keybase for rail ties. This was missed in the security fix for local dev. CI doesn't have a temp directory in the apps built for testing, so these end up failing. This adds the secret keybase, so we don't need to generate one. Talks about the problem being fixed, even where and how the bug was introduced. That can certainly be useful. Mentions what this commit adds and why. Again, this is less than the amount of information that you would share with someone who walked by your desk and asked what you were working on, if people walking by desks were still a thing. But it gives us a lot to work with if we're thinking of changing the underlying code here. What made those messages better than some of the others that we looked at? Context. Why is context important? Well, to illustrate my point, I'm going to go back to a Dr. Seuss story. Not a Seussical poem, but a story about Theodore Geisel. That's Dr. Seuss's real name. And one of his stories, Horton Hears a Who, in which an elephant named Horton vows to protect a tiny civilization floating on a speck of dust, met with ridicule from the other animals who can't or won't hear them. Horton proclaims, a person's a person, no matter how small. Here's some context for you. Theodore Geisel was born in 1904, and like many people at the time, it was pretty racist. I'm not going to put those images on the screen, but famously, he drew really troubling images of Japanese citizens in the run up to World War II as a political cartoonist, amongst plenty of other examples. But after the war, he traveled to Japan, met the people there, saw their relationship with the American occupation, and heard their direct experience with nuclear weapons. and wrote Horton Hears a Who as an allegory about the war. Some lines in there are referencing the atom bomb falling out of the sky, even. He also drew this cartoon. It says, "What this country needs is a good mental insecticide." And Uncle Sam is spraying the racial prejudice bug out of the heads of a line of Americans. Without the context, Horton is a silly book with a good message. With the context, it becomes one man's attempt to admit the wrongs of his past attitudes in a very public way and influence others to realize the same mistakes in themselves, or at least inoculate the young'uns as best he could. Just as a work of art cannot be fully understood without context, code can be difficult to impossible to wrap your head around without it. The commit itself is going to tell you who, what, where, when, how, but it's missing why. It's a blessing and a curse of programming that there are a million different ways to solve every problem. It's less like engineering and math and more like creative writing. We're constantly making decisions that have consequences to the future, and there's always a reason that we make the decisions we do. Record that reason in a commit message because you or someone else might need it. How many times have you looked into a file that you didn't write only to think, why does this look like this? How many times have you looked into a file that you did write and thought, why does this look like this? Wouldn't it be great if we could hover over a line of code in our editors and read a note explaining exactly why a thing looks the way it does? Well, we can, and here it is in VS Code. This is the extension GitLens. This file is in the Rails source code, active record. You can see the module name. Let's jump down a few lines and hover the mouse on line 44. Have you ever had an annotated Shakespeare book before? How about annotated source code? You already have it. But who is all this context for anyway? Other developers who are changing this code, using this API, debugging an issue, anyone who might write something that executes our code in the future. Well, counterpoint, what if I'm the only one working on this? Great. Other developers can mean you in the future. To properly review code, you're going to need more than just seeing the change, especially if you're using a tool that truncates a diff. The reviewer might not even be seeing all the code that's affected by this change. Do you see there on the left? The line numbers go from 120 to 167. That's 47 lines of hidden code. Who knows what could be in there without opening each and every fold? But that's what the PR comment is for. 100% agree. But that means you already agree that context is important. So why wouldn't you save it in history instead of throwing it out when the code gets merged? Has anyone ever searched for something because you're stuck, only to find a blog post from one of your colleagues or even yourself that gives you the answer? You can have that without Googling, or if your internet is down, with rich messaging. What's going to be easier to capture? Context while you're closer to your thoughts, or a summary at the end of feature work after the fact? It's the same with TDD, writing tests up front and as you work, or going back in and struggling to cover all your bases. I'm willing to admit that that's what won baby developer me over to actually doing TDD instead of just thinking it's a good idea. When you're in the middle of feature development, you have all the energy of an exciting new task. And if we write our thoughts in the Git history as we go, we can leverage that immediacy and capture helpful information for the project's future developers. And tooling makes it easy to copy out any relevant information for code review into the PR. The body of a commit message doesn't need to be a novel or an entire page of documentation. The explanation should match the size of the context to share. But what do we write? It's part of a public interface. How could it be used or extended? What's relying on it to not change? We're Rails developers. We love conventions. We can all speak more or less the same language, and it should be easy for new developers to come onto a project if it looks Railsy enough. Did something need to go against a convention for some reason? Is there a non-obvious side effect that falls out of this change? This never happens. But did the actual execution of a library or an API not line up with the documentation? Are there any gotchas this code introduces? Are there pitfalls that you saw when you were up to your elbows in this subsystem that would be good to know about in the future? Think what precise domain knowledge you have right then that you want to remember. Try to write a message that will make sense without seeing the code. Not to replicate the code method for method, but if reading the Git logs without the code open makes sense, then the history becomes a much more useful document. Is there an external resource that applies? A link to a ticket, feature spec or user story, PR comments, Slack discussions? You can deep link those. Resources that you use, Stack Overflow answers, blog posts, videos, documentation, specifications. But remember also that links aren't forever. The message should still make sense. We all refer to old code as a reference from time to time. How did I solve this thing last time? A little explanation, and you're leaving breadcrumbs about how a design pattern, library, or technique worked or didn't work, and you're able to be one step ahead next time. I've had some success with tagging my messages, not Git tags, plain text tags to search, either with GitHub search box or with Git log on the command line. And really, self documenting completely self contained context free code is kind of nigh impossible, and at worst, and it's an excuse not to try. Even if you're using a tool like Swagger to generate API documentation, that's just adding more what and why we wrote some code one way isn't necessarily going to be helpful for someone looking up what arguments a function takes. So why doesn't go there. But it can be helpful for someone who is making a change to the code. API docs and code comments don't stay in sync with the code as written, but commit messages persist exactly the same length of time as the code they describe, because new code necessarily changes the messages. Change your code and update docs for free. So we've talked about why we want to write better messages and how we can assemble a useful Git history, but it sounds like we're going to get to know our way around some parts of Git that might be unfamiliar. Because treating the commit history as a kind of documentation requires a little more thought towards what commits you leave behind. Git has a lot of baked in tools to help us accomplish just that, like a message template. Many of us are probably familiar with this message. It's what appears when you start a new commit from the command line. This is customizable. It doesn't have to be the same as this. If a team has a standard of what should be included in the message, we can leave prompts for ourselves to fill in. Remember that in the default message, any line with the octothorpe will be ignored. On line 12, we see closes. With an issue number, GitHub will close the related issue once this commit is merged to the default branch. Any of these keywords will work for GitHub. Close, closes, closed. If you don't use GitHub, many other tools have similar features as well. This example has with guides in case we can't set a hard wrap. Also includes a reference to tags in the subject line. This is a convention popular in projects like Angular, Electron, and some other places. It's called conventional commits. I'm not going to touch on that exactly here, but the super simplified version to make commit messages both more human readable and helpful, but also machine parsable. So to make this template thing happen, we make a plain text file. It'll look like, yeah, okay, just that. Whatever we want to have at the top, we write it in. Save this wherever you want. Perhaps you'll have a .files management system, and I'll happily geek out about that if anyone wants. You know who you are. Tell Git where to find the template in the Git config. That's a file that lives in the home directory, or for Windows. There are plenty of configuration options possible in here, but the one we care about right now is this. Commit in brackets is the section heading template equals, is the section heading, template equals, and then the path to the file we just made. If this is the only configuration in this file, it's totally valid. And that is commit templates. Now, sometimes small changes need to happen after a commit, a white space fix, or we want to change a variable name. But we've written a really great message, insightful, future-aware comment. What's that going to do to the messages for that file? It's kind of a contrived example, but here's a bit of code. We see that there are some typos. Autocomplete makes that easy sometimes, means it's valid code, but it's got to be fixed anyway. So if we fix the typo and commit again, what are the commit messages going to look like? Good messages on all the lines, but the typo fix overrides it on some fairly important places. Sometimes there are changes that aren't worth a commit message, but there needs to be a commit. Or maybe there's a commit you need for development that doesn't need to be pushed up or merged, right? You don't have to retype or copy paste messages. There's a command to merge commits, and we can sweep that typo or work in progress under the rug. No one needs to know it ever existed. If you've had trouble with rebase in the past, that's all right. We don't need to grok the concept in the same way with this technique. -I means that this is interactive rebase, and we're just going to change within our current branch. This allows us a lot of flexibility in manipulating the commit history, and it's done by opening a text file in your chosen editor. More on that in a minute. This file is going to serve as a set of instructions to Git on how it should handle each commit. We'll see that they're listed out in order, oldest to newest. First is the action we want Git to take for each commit, defaulting to pick. Second is the short form hash that acts as ID for the commit. And finally, the subject line of our commit message. Note here the body of the messages are not displayed, just the subject for now. Another reason why a descriptive subject line is important: try messing around with the Git history with a bunch of subject lines like some changes to model. And helpfully, the available actions we can use are listed below in the commented out portion. I've lightened some because we're only going to cover these 4 today. First up is pick. It's the default action for each commit, and it basically means use this commit. Don't do anything. Replay it into the history just the way it was. Next is reword. Use this commit, but edit the commit message. Let's take a look at what a reword action looks like in practice. Before we start, let's take a look at the commit we want to change. It's the last commit relative to where we are now. So we'll use git log head tilde to mean show me the message on the commit right before head. We don't need to memorize the content here to understand what happens next, so let's continue. We'll use our git rebase -I to get started. And first step is to change the text on the line of the commit we want to reword. Then save and close the file. Git will read in those instructions and proceed. Git opens a new commit prompt, same as if it was a brand new commit, but pre-populated with the message that currently exists. We're going to make a really obvious change to show what's going on. No, we're not changing the subject line here. Oh yeah, give the stock at RailsConf first. But we could if we wanted to. Let's log the same message and see what it looks like now. All changed. I'll superimpose the old log. And as you can see, the commit hash here has changed because the content of the commit changed in the message, but the date, everything else stays the same. Next up is squash. I find this one the most useful for managing unnecessary commits or creating commits that more succinctly encompass the work for a branch. Because sometimes development needs more commits than we're going to need in main. I'm looking at these 3 commits. Seems like they're doing very similar things, and I want to have the messages and changes merged into one commit to push it up for code review. What I want to do is to take the commits on lines 3 and 4 and merge them into the commit on line 2. When you label a commit for squashing, it will be merged into the commit before it. So remember that, squashes move up. And because the contents of the commit has changed, we'll amend the subject too. Let's see it in practice. We'll fire up interactive rebase. Same as before, but now we choose squash. Save and quit. This file that is opened is where we tell Git what to do with the messages. As 3 commits become 1, each message is delineated with a comment. And each section consists of the commit subject, a blank line, and the message. If we did nothing, the new commit message would look just like this without the comments. But it doesn't seem necessary to me to keep the outdated subjects. So I'll remove the comments too, so I can see what the finished project is going to, or finished result's going to look like. The first line will become our new subject. And this doesn't accurately reflect what this commit is changing, so we can update that as well. And we'll take a look at the new commit now that we're all done. I'm going to use git log -- one line to see a compact version of the log with only subjects, and copy the shortcode to use for our git logging. Start the printout at that specific commit. And there it is. Finally is fixup, which doesn't need a whole run through because fixup merges up like squash, but the commit message is just deleted. This is perfect for those typos or white space commits. I could literally spend another hour going through git commands and minutia. So if you wanted more of that, um, this slide isn't relevant because you can't go to the workshop at RailsConf 2018. That's for me. I made a bold promise in the talk description that I would teach you how to do all of this git wrangling in an editor other than Vim. So first, I want to show you how to use Vim just enough not to have to open another application, so you can stay in terminal for all your message crafting needs. Git commit will likely drop you into Vim, yes, and that can be a scary place if you don't know all of the arcane incantations required. But you can handle committing and message editing with 3 commands. Nothing works the way you're used to when you first get into Vim. It's because you're in a mode for navigating the text, not editing. So to edit, you must enter insert mode. Press I to get into insert mode, and then you can type and move around the way that you're used to. Even the arrow keys work here. When you're done editing, you'll need to press escape. No mnemonic, cancel out of insert mode by pressing escape. To complete the process, you'll type WQ, : to enter a command, W to write, and Q to quit. That's I, type your message, escape, : write, quit. Now you know Vim. But if you feel the need to use another editor, all we're going to have to do is open up that git config and add another setting. Core as the heading, editor equals, then the command to open your editor from the command line. Sometimes you're going to have to install that command. It should be in your editor's FAQ or the like if you don't have it already set. If you use VS Code, you'll need to append -- wait to the command, or it will only open a blank file. Or you can run this command from the command line just once. So I hope you all have started to form your own idea of what a good commit message is. I think you'll find the answer to how do we write good commit messages is different in every team, for every person, every situation, while still considering its usefulness. I'm going to close with my answer to that, a line that is very quickly becoming my personal catchphrase. The answer is, like the answer to most things, is with empathy. Empathy for your teammates, empathy for yourself, empathy for developers of the future you might never meet. Once when I was describing this talk to a coworker, they called me a commit message archaeologist. So I encourage you to become commit message archaeologists and at the same time to leave something behind that can be useful for fellow archaeologists. And even if you can't convince everyone else to work with that commit message, convince everyone else you work with, the commit messages should be more than, if you're one in a team of 5, then taking up the mantle of meaningful commit messages still means that you have 20% more of a chance that a commit message can save your bacon too. And once your message saves someone else, maybe it'll be a 40% chance, then 60. So I'll leave you with that thought. Thanks. Oh, thanks everybody. I'm just gonna quickly go through the chat messages here because I didn't get a chance to read. Awesome, excellent. Yeah, Stephanie, me too. Good commit messages for myself. Awesome. Well, I think I'm just at time here. I want to thank everybody for coming and participating. I will be over in the factory bot track if you want to jump over there. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for participating in Open Summit.
thoughtbot is proud to have over 1 billion downloads of our open source projects and a 20-year track record of helping clients nurture amazing product teams.
When your team works with thoughtbot, you get personalized coaching and hands-on pairing to elevate your skills and also drive your product forward.
Want more collaboration with thoughtbot? Let's build something great together. Reach out to us at thoughtbot.com/hire-us.
And stay tuned for more FactoryBot and LangChain tracks.